Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us in this edition of India and the World Book Talk. My name is Deep Pal, and I'm a visiting scholar in the Asia program at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Today, we are here to discuss Ananth Krishnan and Stanley Johny's new book, The Comrades and the Mullahs, China, Afghanistan, and the New Asian Geopolitics, in which they trace China's emergence as a key player in Afghanistan, drawing on their travels to China's western frontiers, as well as the internal dynamics pushing Beijing's westward march. They examine China's interest in Afghanistan, the drivers of foreign policy towards the country, and its impact on Asian and, in fact, global geopolitics. Through this webinar, we will aim to understand the role of China in Afghanistan and its impact in the world. With that, let me introduce our stellar group of speakers for today's discussion. We start with the authors, Ananth Krishnan. He's the China correspondent for The Hindu and currently is based in Hong Kong. In 2019, he was a visiting fellow at Brookings India. He was previously the Beijing-based associate editor at the India Today Group as well. He has followed China since 2009, and his reporting has taken him to all but 3 of China's 33 provinces and regions. He's the author of the book India's China Challenge, which came out in 2020. Also joining us, Stanley Johny, international affairs editor with the Hindu newspaper. He has been writing on international affairs and Indian foreign policy in Hindu group publications for nearly a decade. He's an IVLP fellow of the US State Department and an India-Australia Youth Dialogue alumnus. He's also author of The ISIS Caliphate from Syria to the Doorsteps of India, which came out in 2018. We are also joined by Aziz Amin, who is a governance professional with cross-disciplinary experience in policy analysis, in security, and socio-political participation in conflict and post-conflict settings in Afghanistan and the South Asian region. He served as the principal secretary and special assistant for President Johny of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan until the collapse of Kabul in August 2021. He has also served in a range of policy positions in the Afghan government, including in the Election Commission, the Ministry of Urban Development and Land, the Ministry of Borders and Tribal Affairs, and in SARC. He writes about the socio-political and security issues in South Asia and the Middle East. And last but by no means the least, Dr. Jennifer B. Murtazashvili is a non-resident scholar in the Asia program at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. She is the founding director of the Center for Governance and Markets and associate professor at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Pittsburgh. Her research focuses on issues of self-governance, security, political economy, and public sector reform in the developing world. She has done extensive fieldwork in the region, particularly in Afghanistan. Her book, Informal Order and the State in Afghanistan, brought out by Cambridge in 2016, looks at the rules of systems of community-based customary governance and how they contributed to the political order in Afghanistan. Welcome, everyone. And the way we are thinking of doing this is starting off with some questions that we will field to the panelists and those of you who have joined us on Zoom, on YouTube, or on any other social media platform. Please feel free to send in your questions in the comment box in the platform you're using. Our team is going to gather them together and we are going to bring them to the panelists. Ananth, if I can start off with you, you have talked and written about how China sees itself as a global player in a scenario that they believe indicates the irreversible decline of the West, most significantly the United States. Now, between August 2021 and now, after the publication of this book even, there have been a number of global events that we are still trying to reckon with, understand the full importance of. Does that affect the role that China sees for itself in Afghanistan?
Thank you so much, Deep, for having us today, and to Carnegie India as well. And thanks also to Jennifer and Aziz for sparing the time to join us for this event today. We both really appreciate it. I've been thinking, when looking at the global sort of response to making sense of China's stand on Ukraine, there are a few common threads that kind of sort of came to my mind, themes that we explored when writing this book. And one dominant theme that we keep coming back to throughout the book is that of China-US rivalry, and how much the downturn in China-US relations, as well as almost this kind of obsession in Beijing that they have looking at America, informs so much of their policies, even in terms of the response to Ukraine, even in terms of what we detail in the book, the kind of propaganda that they milked out of the fall of Kabul. especially in the media in China. And so I think that it's a very useful lens to kind of try and understand what China's motivations are. And I think that the other thing that wanted me to go deep into this book. So Stanley and I actually, just to give our viewers a little bit of background how this project even came about, Stanley and I had a conversation triggered by the visit of the Taliban delegation to Tianjin in July 2021. And at that point of time, we just thought that this is such a fascinating relationship between such two different parties. And seeing this delegation being hosted in Tianjin made me think that, in India, the China-Afghanistan relationship is going to be one of so much consequence, but one that we know so little about. And that kind of got us into a conversation and going deep into this, but we were kind of overtaken by events. We assumed there would be 6 months or God knows how long before things would come to a conclusion. And no one expected, or few people expected, the fall of Kabul, and we kind of decided to speed up and do the best we can in a few months. So what we try and do is map out the past of China-Afghan relations and interactions and the present. And I will add a qualifier, Deep, that we're writing as to reporters and journalists on really fluid events, which I'm sure that scholars will have so much material to come back to. And this was kind of our effort to kind of just map out things as they are at this very interesting point of time.
Yeah, I mean, what I was thinking of while reading this is how much analytical effort it takes to make sense of such a fluid situation. And I mean, as is often said, that journalism is the first draft of history. So as far as that is concerned, this definitely fits the bill. Stanley, I was looking at the cover and this photo of Mullah Baradar with Wang Yi. When it first came out, there were comparisons that were drawn with Ronald Reagan meeting the Mujahideen, right? And I'm curious if you think that it's fair to how far it is to draw that comparison in terms of how the players see themselves in this situation, or in fact the situation itself.
Yeah, I think if you look at the events in Afghanistan from a Chinese point of view, so I think there are both sides in a sense. On the one side, of course, China sees an opportunity in America's withdrawal from Afghanistan, because from a global point of view, China and the United States are now the most important two countries, which are also two, very powerful two competitors, rival powers. And with the withdrawal of the United States, what China saw was that it was getting rid of American presence from its backyard. So from a geopolitical point of view, that kind of gives China an opportunity to at least seek to expand its influence further. So in that moment, yeah, it is, it is very, very important if you look at it from China's point of view. But at the same time, it also deepens China's security concerns, the events in Afghanistan. Because there were some interesting developments. You referred to the cover picture, which was also the trigger of the book. So the idea of the book was born out of this image, to be specific. Ananth and myself discussed about it, and then Ananth was telling me that there is a cracking book topic on the subject which we have to explore further. But Ananth is also, in the chapters, we are also writing about a meeting that happened before the Tianjin meeting, between the Chinese foreign minister and the Pakistani foreign minister. In which the Chinese and the Pakistanis, they come together, and then they kind of, agree on some 5 pillars of their engagement with regard to Afghanistan. Which is, of course, to promote political reconciliation in Afghanistan, to stop Afghanistan from falling into an outright civil war, and also to defeat terrorism in Afghanistan. And the statement, the communique name CTIM. It also calls for working with the regional mechanisms, multilateral mechanisms, working with Afghanistan's neighbors. So this happened just a few weeks before Wang Yi met Mullah Baradar. So this explains China's concerns about the developments in Afghanistan. And and the Chinese diplomats have said on record that the United States is not kind of living up to its own responsibility in Afghanistan and leaving a security black hole in Afghanistan. So this is how China, looked at the developments in Afghanistan. But at the same time, when a Chinese envoy was asked after Kabul was taken over by the Taliban, was asked whether it was a victory for Pakistan and whether it would eventually help China's own interests. Chinese envoy says on record, China's representative, China's special envoy for Afghanistan, says that, he says in a way that it could be seen like it is a victory for, it could be seen as a victory for Pakistan. And then Pakistan is the all-weather friend, the iron brother. The China-Pakistan relationship it's higher than Himalayas, sweeter than honey, or whatever you call it. So the Chinese were also looking at it, from that point of view. So I think of course, so they see this dilemma. On the one side, you have this opportunity of vacating the United States, another great power from Afghanistan. That could open up, further opportunities for you, because at a very very important time when China was investing heavily in Pakistan through the CPEC, it is expanding its influence in Pakistan. While at the same time, China is also, as we mentioned in the book, China is facing security challenges in Pakistan as well, and it is reliant on the Pakistani military establishment to ensure security for its own investments. So what will happen in Afghanistan is, of course, on the one side, China is ready. I think China has already seen, as that image shows, that Wang Yi or the Chinese political leadership is ready to engage the Taliban. I think that is, everybody agrees that. Because Wang Yi visited recently, a couple of weeks ago, Wang Yi went to Kabul. They are ready to engage the Taliban. But the Chinese, I think, are also aware of the challenges that are awaiting them in Afghanistan. So, as we say, they are taking a very pragmatic but very wary approach to Afghanistan. They find opportunities in Afghanistan, but they would, I think, wait and see and then take a decision based on how effectively the Taliban would manage to stabilize Afghanistan.
In fact, I was going to come to the Pakistan question, and I saw Jen smile when you started talking about it. And Jen, I'll come to you in a second. But Ananth, if I can come back to you a little bit, I mean, one of the first things to come off the conversation so far is how unlikely it seems to have, as you call them, the Mullahs and the Comrades in some form of a relationship together. Given that, if you can give us a sense of what then makes this a relationship, what guides it. You in the book you talk about how there are concerns within the Communist Party, right, about building a relationship with the Taliban. What is it? What makes the CCP look beyond its ideological issues and take a pragmatic step as this?
I think we've seen with China that they are the quintessential pragmatists, I think, in everything that they do. And I think that really comes out in this relationship. And we kind of talk about the somewhat glaring contradictions of that when they are presenting themselves as being this very different power from the West. But at the same time, when you see the things that are happening within China, we have a chapter on, for instance, on Xinjiang. So what they are saying abroad in terms of the kind of power that they see themselves as being, and some of the actions they're doing at home, there are a few contradictions in that. And I think that kind of speaks to their pragmatism. But the broader question, Deep, one of the things that I kind of wanted to sort of stress when you look at the China-Afghanistan relationship is, I think sometimes there is a bit of hype because we've seen this lens of Afghanistan's past history where you've had one big power followed by another. So there's this default expectation that when the US leaves, someone has to come in and fill that void. And you see that often in the media as well, where every time the Chinese come in and sign a contract, you get these headlines saying, oh, China is going to take over the entire mineral wealth of Afghanistan. But actually the reality is a lot more messy. And so that's kind of something that I wanted to really go deep and look at. Even within China, some of the Chinese voices that come out in this book, you don't find anyone saying that they want to go in there and take over the country and do what the US did. They're saying something else, and they're talking about their own limitations. They're talking about the risks. And of course, they're talking about finding interest where they can. But I think they see themselves as being a very, very different power from what we've seen from the US and what we've seen in the past as well. And on a final note, I think that Xi Jinping's China is obviously very different from what you saw pre-2012, pre-2013. And you've seen the Belt and Road Initiative has been the sort of biggest reflection of the changes in how China sees its position in the world. But having said all that, I think even the Chinese are thinking through what kind of power they want to be and how they exercise their power beyond their borders. As much as we like to think of the Chinese as being these, far-sighted strategists who plan 20 years in advance, it's not often the case. And they're often reacting to things on the ground. And I think it will be interesting to actually see how this unfolds. And it's important to keep in mind that often, I think in the book, we pointed out that it kind of suited both the Taliban, who didn't want to be isolated internationally, and China, who were milking the US exit to kind of, inflate what their relationship was actually about and what they were going to do with it. But I think the real test would be actually seeing how these things translate to on the ground. And that's something that I think has come out, even if you look at the last 10, 15 years of China's presence in Afghanistan. It's still very much one of unfulfilled promise, rather than something more ambitious than that.
Jen, in fact, on that note, if I can ask you, in Central Asia, we have seen China become an influential player, not just politically but also economically, right? But when it comes to Afghanistan, and as Ananth was also mentioning, I mean, in Mess-Aynak's copper mine, lots of promises, not much came of it. In Amu Darya's oil field, a similar story. Now, given all of that, how easy or how possible does it become for China to maybe take the CPEC or the BRI right up to Afghanistan's doorstep?
So I think this is the $1 million question, but I just want to first congratulate the authors on such a remarkable book. It's a real honor and pleasure to be here to discuss it, and it's a very, very timely piece of work. So although academics, all we do is critique. But it really takes the hard work of journalists to tell the story. And so I just want to congratulate the both of you on just really an incredible piece of incredible book that is so timely. Now, in terms of, I think this is a really important point that Ananth just made about the news headlines. And similarly here in the United States, we've seen the same thing, is that, as the United States has left Afghanistan, there's this question about the US ceding and withdrawing and looking into itself and ceding the rest of the world to China's influence. And that's a very simplistic way of looking at the world. And I think, as others have pointed out, there's enormous interest, I think, in China and in many other countries to invest inside of Afghanistan. But given the security situation, the real inability to understand how the Taliban will govern, I think it's pretty clear now, after some smoke has cleared in the very beginning, that they are embarking on a very strong authoritarian regime, and they are consolidating power. And in some ways, this could be very advantageous for China and other countries in the region who really are not that interested in Afghanistan's internal dimensions in the same way the United States was, but are really looking for a power that can bring order and stability. And so if we look at the interests of China, if we look at the interests of Russia, if we look at the interests of Central Asian countries, what they really care about, the immediate neighbors, is the ability of the Taliban to provide order. And so their concerns are primary in the security field. So we've seen all of this talk about investments from China taking over all of these, the mines, of course, all of the mineral resources. But we know that China's been involved in this for years. This is not an area, this is not a new area for China. So we've seen how these investments have not panned out. And so China is not I don't think, willing to take unnecessary risks here for some, vainglorious military expedition. I think what they're really interested to see is whether the Taliban can provide security, and then we can see whether or not, future investments can pan out. But China's not interested in losing money. They're primarily interested in security. And so this is where I think the United States, Russia, and China do have, mutual interests still in Afghanistan, is in this area of security. But, looking at the Central Asian republics, they're looking to this corridor connecting Central Asia to South Asia. Pakistan has been interested in this for so long, and even India has been quite interested in this. But that takes, India's interest in this takes peaceful relations with Pakistan, the ability to conduct trade with Pakistan. Pakistan is very interested in this corridor to the north. Central Asia is very interested in the corridor to the south. When you are small landlocked countries, the more trade routes you have, the better. And so looking what's happening right now in terms of Russia and sanctions, these issues become even more imperative. And so seeing Afghanistan as a trade route, especially for the Central Asian countries, is really important. I'm not sure how important that is for China. China has other options that it can look to, and how important Afghanistan is for that, I'm not sure. But definitely they are looking to see whether the Taliban can provide the kind of security, not only to prevent internal unrest, but of course the issue of terrorism in Xinjiang and the issue of the Uyghurs is really forefront in the issue of China.
You brought up Russia and you brought up India, and those are questions we will get to in a minute. But this is a great time for me to segue into what I want to ask Aziz, which is basically about the internal situation in Afghanistan in terms of the Taliban government, their governance, their territorial control, public goods, and so on and so forth. And what could possibly the Taliban at this point expect from China?
Well, thank you, Deep, and hello everyone. And it is a real pleasure to be here. And of course, congratulations to both Ananth as well as Stanley for writing this wonderful piece. When we talk about the 8 months of Taliban rule, we talk both about seeing it from as an observer perspective. I think we need to see both the achievements as well as the failures of the Taliban. So in the last 8 months, the Taliban achievements, their first achievements was that once the Kabul collapsed, the maintaining law and order in Kabul, particularly there was, given Afghanistan past a poignant history of regime change, we experienced chaos, lootings, even rape. But in Afghanistan this time, last August, it did not happen. The Taliban did materialize their writ, as well as not allowing their properties to be stolen, and let's say any chaos. They didn't allow any chaos to happen. The second thing was the maintaining law and order across the country, where they control the entire country now, and their method of our approach to the security establishment is very harsh and orderly security regime across the country, with a particular focus on urban centers. Because Taliban used to control, they used to be operate within the rural areas mainly, but they did not have experience of controlling the urban centers. But after we see that they have been successfully maintaining order in the urban center as well. And Afghanistan has a lot of major cities, particularly Kabul, Herat, Jalalabad, Mazar-e-Sharif, Khost, and Kandahar. So that has been their success. And Taliban maintaining their internal cohesion, both on political as well as on policy level issues, have been, although there has been some tussle going on between them, but they have maintained that political cohesion so far, even within the ranks as well as within their own political spectrum. And the third was their success. I mean, fourth was the clamping down on drugs and opium cultivation, that last week that they announced that they would be not allowing the poppy cultivation, and they ban that. Although time will prove that how that ban is effective, but as far as concerning their rule, I think that is one of their achievements currently. And the execution of public amnesty has been, although it had some downfalls, but it has been a success. In arbitrary killings, extrajudicial killings, detention, and beatings of former Afghanistan National Security Forces members, as well as the detention of political and social activists, which is very unfortunate. But in the Taliban have to stop them. But given Afghanistan 20 years of war in the local differences, I think every one of you know that when a war happens, there comes, when two parties are involved, and the other is victorious. So this revenge killing does take place. However, given that history of Afghanistan, we had that it has been somehow a success. But of course, it's very unfortunate that there has been a violation. They also, on an economic front, they maintain currency value. So far, they have maintained Afghanistan from currency, Afghani from falling further. And I think they paid salaries to the government, even former government employees, that had been their success as well. So we have to give them a credit for that. When we talk about failures, I think these failures are something that is actually affecting those, let's say, could strengthen those the achievements as well. And one is the failing to form an inclusive government. I mean, everybody knows that Afghanistan is a very pluralistic society. We have a multi-ethnic society. But so far, the Taliban government has not been a government where every Afghan see that themselves, regardless of their political, social, religious, ethnic, or professional backgrounds, and they're which leaves the question of domestic legitimacy unanswered as well. And I believe they also failed to implement the Doha Agreement in its true essence. I think the allowing girls to school, media, freedom of media, and freedom of press, political consensus, inclusive government, respecting women's rights and human rights. But since taken the power, the Taliban have made disappointing decisions regarding, like recently they made women's freedom, they restricted women's freedom of movement. They also restricted or reversed the decision of girls' education. And bearing media such as the BBC, VOA to broadcast in even local languages, let alone the local media that has been shrinking. And I think they also failed on international front with the international community. When we talk about international community, we only speak about, we mainly refer to West in the West, US, it doesn't include Pakistan, because Pakistan and Iran, they have been in the other some regional countries. They have been okay with the Taliban because they have no issue with it and they have been supporting it. So they have been failing to find a common ground with the international community. They have not been recognized and they did not live up to their promises. As I stated before, that keeping internal cohesion for Taliban was an achievement, or is an achievement, but it also comes at what stops the Taliban from coming into an agreement with the international community. I believe one of the major factor or barrier is the Taliban fighters. Like they have in the past 20 years, they have told or indoctrined their fighters that the objective of the war was to fight the Western values, which was like media, allowing girls to work, media the way it operated, and their women inclusion in public spheres, and working with the international community. So these were the certain values that they intoxicated and taught to their fighters and wage a war against on these values. So I think it's very difficult for them to tell these fighters that we want to work with those the former government officials and or let's say allow women to work, allow women to go to school. The fighters will certainly question them, and if that comes at the expense of their unity, they are exposed to a great danger. And failure of governance, we see that, as Jennifer mentioned, that it's they have been failed on delivering the services, public services. Particularly, one example is that I will give is the passport office. It cannot function properly. They changed 2 of their directors, and the other fear that the Taliban is that the Taliban leadership is now very much scared of their own, and they cannot actually rectify it. Is the moral, financial, and administrative corruption that is happening within the Taliban government. One is it has created fear and dissent. For instance, the minister or a deputy minister, if a minister is appointed or a deputy minister is appointed on a particular ministry, he brings his own wartime or warfield associates, relatives and friends and family members, just because they don't look at the qualification of the individual. They don't look even whether it is justifiable that this particular person would be able to deliver in that particular position, but because of the association that they had back when they were fighting, that has been the main thing. And I believe the corruption that I spoke was that I mentioned was the Haji Alam Gul Haqqani, who was the passport director. He was removed because of corruption allegations. So I think it has been lagging behind on many fronts. The success has been very less, but the failures overshadow the success. Thank you.
Okay, so we are about halfway into the conversation, and we have some questions coming in. What I'm going to do is try and weave them into the conversation. And one of the questions, in fact, Jen, I want to come to you with this one, is basically we have had people who are essentially asking about the prospect of how long do we expect to see Taliban rule in Afghanistan, if there's any indications 8 months down the line, and essentially, while so far most countries have not recognized the government, we are talking days after we have seen the Moscow embassy of the country being handed over to the Taliban. We have reports of the Islamic Emirate flag being hoisted inside. Right, accreditations being accepted. Now, again, the geopolitical changes that we started talking about, where we are seeing China and Russia come closer. What kind of effects might we see on the acceptance of the Taliban, working with the Taliban in these very rapidly changing times?
So I think that where we're going to see the most interaction is going to come from the immediate neighbors, right? So these are the countries who are so affected by what goes on inside of Afghanistan, whether this is from refugee flows, whether this is from trade issues, whether this is from security concerns. So these countries don't have much of a choice. They can pretend that Afghanistan doesn't exist, but I think they understand the real risks to that. So I think countries are engaging with the Taliban very pragmatically. I don't think anyone is particularly happy that the Taliban is in power. And I think it's a mistake to understand the willingness of countries to work with the Taliban as some sort of, this is a preferred partner. I don't think the Taliban was anyone's preferred partner. The problem was that the US intervention in the government of Afghanistan was not a viable alternative. And so that the longer the US was there, the worse the outcomes were, not only for the Afghan people over time, but for the neighbors themselves. And so, if you're a neighbor to the north, or if you're China and you're looking to Afghanistan and the security situation, we saw the instability increase, especially over the past 6 or 7 years, and in particular, northern Afghanistan. So Russia's interest in this, in particular, the really interesting move that they have made to almost recognize the Taliban, that they are allowing the Taliban to have. They're recognizing the Taliban delegation, basically, and this seems like it was in exchange for this, the banning of narcotics, ostensible banning of narcotics. This is something that Russia has wanted for a very long time, and something that they have real concerns about, drug use, drug trafficking among their own population. So they put a lot of pressure on the Taliban to do this. They got this concession, and then days later, we see the Russians recognize the Taliban delegation. But, is the Taliban going to be able to deliver a ban on opium cultivation? I don't think so. I think this was done for external consumption. This would devastate the Taliban's own internal political economy if they were to do this. There are few viable alternatives in the economy right now, especially given the Taliban's unwillingness to compromise on very key governance issues that seems to be the key to unlocking much more humanitarian aid, to stabilizing the economy even more. So I think that, countries are looking at this with really pragmatic lenses. And so security is still at the heart of this. And so we're not even at the economic issues that are so fundamental. And there's, it's a real shame because there's a real opportunity right now, I think, for many countries in the region to engage positively. For the first time, we're seeing, Central Asian countries really open up. The changes in Uzbekistan have been really quite important to that. And, the real opportunity for positive sum relations among countries. And given the Taliban's inability to compromise on many of these issues, it's a real lost opportunity for the people of Afghanistan in particular.
Jen, staying on Russia, we have seen Russia traditionally be a major active player in the region, in Central Asia, and of course in Afghanistan as well. Now, moving forward, do you see Russia following its independent policies in the region, in Afghanistan and beyond, or is there a possibility that their goals will now be far more aligned with China's?
So I think that their goals are aligned with China for the time being, because both of them share this primary concern of security. And China is very happy to have Russian forces guarding the border with Central Asia. So, there's 7,000, 8,000 troops in southern Tajikistan, and these are CSTO troops. Now, it's really interesting to see, I think, what China, and I'll be curious to hear from the others, how they view, will China's attitude towards this change at all, given Russia's devastating military losses inside of Ukraine? I think for many, China was very happy to have Russia providing the security role that, China could play sort of a more positive, good cop economic, looking at economic issues and dealing with the Taliban along those lines. And Russia would work on the security issues and have a primary focus on that with its troops. Will those troops be there for very long? Are they going to be needed elsewhere? And then how is Russia really viewed now as its military prowess? Can Russia really defend this border, given what's happened in Ukraine? I think there's a lot of questions about Russia's effectiveness, but Russia's concern here is security, and it's aligned with China's interests. So I don't see in the short term a huge divergence in that. And China's very, I think, happy to have Russia playing this role and expending its own forces at the border to save China the effort to do that.
Stanley, same question to you. How does the China-Russia closeness reflect in Afghanistan?
Yeah, I agree, completely agree with what Jen said, because I think for now there is definitely a convergence between the Chinese and the Russians, how they look at Afghanistan. Because, from the Russian point of view, Russia doesn't want any kind of instability to spill over into Central Asia from Afghanistan. So the Russians also see other security challenges, the non-Taliban security challenges, including the ISKP, as a major threat coming out of Afghanistan. So what they want is whoever is in power in Afghanistan right now, whether it is Taliban or it was the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan earlier, they wanted the government of the day to be able to maintain some kind of order in Afghanistan so that it won't have a spillover effect in Central Asia. I think that's what the key Russian security interests are. And the Chinese do share those interests, more or less. But when it comes to, China, I think is a little more ambitious when it comes to Afghanistan. But Russians, I don't think they, beyond that, they have anything to do with, in Afghanistan, or they have any grand plans of investments in Afghanistan. But the Chinese, I think the Chinese would be willing, if provided that the Taliban would be able to stabilize Afghanistan, provide security in Afghanistan. And the Chinese are ready. They have already demonstrated that they would be ready to make investments in Afghanistan or a better relationship with Afghanistan in the future. But as of now, yes, when we look at it from a security point of view, there is a convergence of interest between China and Russia. It is the same case with the Iranians as well, because both, the Russians and the Iranians had reached out to the Taliban, long ago, right from 2008 or even before. The Chinese had established ties in 2015. 2015 and later on 2018, they stepped up the engagements. So it is a completely different scenario compared to 1990s. In the 1990s, you saw we had the Central Asian republics, we had the Russians, the Iranians, also the Indians. They were backing the Northern Alliance, and they looked at Taliban as a hostile force. Right now, at least as of now, I'm not saying that this is the sustainable thing for the Taliban. I'm not saying this policy wouldn't change in the near future, but at least as of now, the Taliban appear to be stronger, and the regional powers are ready to engage the Taliban, and they want to see whether the Taliban would be able to stabilize Afghanistan. I think that is the key thing. And if the Taliban fail to do that, it could change the equations, regional equations. But as of now, I think everybody is taking a practical wait and watch approach to see whether the Taliban would deliver.
Aziz, I'll come to you in a second, but staying on with that question of security in Taliban, we have a question from Kabir Taneja. And Ananth, I'm going to come to you with this one. Essentially, from China's perspective, what kind of security guarantees might China expect, on the Taliban's sincerity in countering terrorism or disbanding foreign terrorists? They have said that there are no more terror groups on its soils, and in the event that it does not materialize, how would Beijing react?
Well, thank you, Kabir, it's an interesting question, and it made me think of the long history of China-Pak conversations on terror groups, where you've had this back and forth where the Chinese keep telling them to crack down on groups, but I think they know, I think they're realistic. And in the book, we quote this one interview with one Chinese expert who said, listen, yes, we've asked the Taliban to make a clean break in quotes. Yes, they've guaranteed that, but let's be honest in the sense that there's also a sense of, for example, outfits of fighters that they fought with, they aren't going to disband them overnight and cut all links with them. I think that they would be more sort of insistent on security for their specific projects and their personnel on the ground. And I don't think they would expect, a complete clean break in that sense. And a sort of a conversation came to mind. I remember it was a few years ago when Amrullah Saleh had come to Beijing for some kind of event. And I remember interviewing him about this. And he was saying that, I gave the Chinese a dossier of, showing where all the ETIM camps were in the Afghan border. And his point was, it didn't really make that much of a dent in terms of China's larger calculus with Pakistan, where they were kind of happy to look the other way when it comes to Pakistan's equation with some terror groups, as long as they felt their narrow interests were being protected.
Aziz, you wanted to come in here.
Yeah, thank you. So I just wanted to add I agree with Jen and Ananth, of course, and Stanley as well. But the durability of the Taliban reign depends on the Taliban behavior and approach to both domestic, regional, and international matters, I believe. For instance, whether they succeed to earn the domestic legitimacy, whether they deliver on the promises, such as allowing girls and women to go to school and to work, as well as form an inclusive government and respect the pluralism of the Afghan society. But what is really important, I find, is that between China and Russia is that unlike the West, both China and Russia and Taliban share many values in common, which is going to heavily influence the relations in the coming days. For instance, the West values democracy, human rights, women's rights, media, girls, and the type of governance. While for China and Russia, these have never been, they always follow a customary policy of being prepared to deal with any government or regime, irrespective of its composition and the route it had taken to attain power. What matters for them is they are being, as Stanley said, they are being very pragmatic in dealing with the contemporary issues that are threatening. And I believe more than economic issues, China and Russia are dealing with the security threat from Afghanistan that might emanate in the future. And one thing I would say, as the players in the outcome of the Ukraine war will also impact the situation in Afghanistan. The players are the same. They have been engaged on a different front. If one bloc wins, that bloc is going to be influencing the decision. But as an Afghan, I believe the Taliban should stay neutral and falling into the orbit of just China, or let's say China and Russia bloc, and going against the Western bloc would be actually jeopardizing the security of the Afghan state, as well as the interest of the Afghans in Afghanistan. And China, since the Taliban takeover, they have just pledged 31 million worth of grain, winter supplies, and vaccines and medicine, nothing else. While the West has been pouring millions and hundreds of millions of dollars in terms of support, like the recent London 2022 Afghanistan conference, which was supposed to collect almost over 4 billion pounds of humanitarian support or assistance for Afghanistan. But Russia actually pledged $2 million as compared to US $512 million, and the UK $374 million, and Germany $219 million, and so the countries. So I think for a country, a global power, which it claims to be, like China, and putting this small amount of money means that they're very wary, and they're just observing, and they want to see what happens on the ground and how the Taliban behave on domestic both international front. Thank you.
Aziz, before we move on quickly, I was curious if you can tell us a little bit about public perceptions of both Russia and China in Afghanistan, because we've been hearing about how their goals are, at least for now, aligned. How easy or difficult would it be for these countries to operate in Afghanistan, as far as how people look at them or think of them is concerned?
That's a very good question. I think, and that's what the Taliban have to, understand, that the local perception is very, very much important, particularly to their foreign policy, or they're dealing with these countries. Let's say in the past 20 years, you accept it or not, but there was a democracy, whether weak democracy, and let's say, in a sense of Jen says that too much centralized government, despite given a lot of weaknesses that the government had. While I was working in the government myself, it still brought relative stability, as well as media was free. We had one of the best media. We were ranked number one around the world in terms of access to information. Our media was free. Women were allowed to go to school and to work, and they were running businesses. And there were people who did not like the government, yet they lived within the government control area and would criticize the government. So because the government was, if even weak, are not lived 100% to its promises, or let's say the aspiration of the Afghan people, yet it was respected and it represented the pluralistic society in picture of the Afghan strata. But the Taliban, I think, for the Russian and in the perception what the Chinese are, and I mean the perception of Afghan about China and Russia is, I think it is no different than what I've been seeing as an Afghan. They do not have a problem with Afghanistan being an autocratic, or let's say authoritarian regime, and they don't care, and they are not much concerned with the pluralistic society, with the Taliban are delivering on their promises on a local level. As I said before, they don't interfere in the internal affairs of the Taliban and how they rule and what they do and what they don't do, unlike the West, as I said. And that what's make it bring it in confrontation with the perception, with the aspiration of the Afghan people. So the Afghan people want a government where they see themselves in the government, and a government that represents their aspiration, and a government where they feel that that is their government. And I believe that could be a decisive factor in a relationship Taliban forge with Russia or China.
Okay, Jen, we have some questions coming in on the security implications, the security guarantees that may come from the Taliban, and the strange dichotomy there where they still have ideological affiliations with a number of terrorist groups that are active in the region. I mean, we have Haqqani in the government in Afghanistan right now. We have the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan operating in Pakistan, and which has ideological affinity with the Taliban in Afghanistan. So essentially, how easy or difficult would it be to live up to these security guarantees, and what does it mean for countries in the region?
Well, I think that this is a really difficult question for the Taliban, because they have not renounced terrorism at all as a means or a strategy to govern. So it's central to their governance strategy. So the bet that China and Russia and other countries in the region, the Central Asian republics, are making, and Pakistan, is that they can use this terror to consolidate power. That in some ways, what I think that Russia is hoping, and this is something that I've seen come up in the Russian media, is that the Taliban can be like a Ramzan Kadyrov in Chechnya, is provide complete and total order so that the country is no longer a problem for its neighbors or for the region. And so this is what you saw happen in Chechnya, for example. And it's using this sort of brutal authoritarian rule that allows the government to maintain stability. I think this is the bet, unfortunately, a very cruel bet that Russia is making. Now, of course, Russia is paying lip service to having a more inclusive government and so forth. But I don't think that, for example, it's particularly worried about this in the long term, that it really just wants stability, and it doesn't really matter at what cost internally. And, as Aziz said, Russia and China, their governance model is perfectly aligned in many ways with the Taliban. They're not concerned about exporting democracy or values. You don't see this kind of discussion. So it's very convenient, and it's easy for them to have these kinds of discussions. But I think the question is what we're actually seeing in Russia right now. Kadyrov, for example, who Russia has placed so many bets on, is upset now with Moscow for its willingness to compromise in Ukraine. And so it's been a marriage of convenience for Moscow, for example, to rely on Kadyrov. But how long will this last? And this becomes very, very risky in the long term if someone becomes upset, if Kadyrov becomes upset with Putin. And I would say the same thing is very true. This analogy is one that I think holds true for Afghanistan as well. It's very convenient for countries in the region to say, okay, the Taliban, we don't care what you do domestically. Don't push the boundaries too hard. The girls should be going to school. There's no other country in the world that bans girls from going to school. we don't want you to be a complete pariah, but we don't really care too much about human rights issues. It's easy for them to say that right now, but this could also come back to bite neighboring countries too. If they're not renouncing terrorism, this marriage of convenience could only last for so long until an interest is violated.
Stanley, the Pakistan question, we've just had meetings between the foreign ministers of Pakistan, China, and Afghanistan less than 2 weeks ago. How does Pakistan fit into this developing relationship between China and Afghanistan?
I think both Pakistan and China need each other when it comes to Afghanistan. You look at it from China's point of view, as we discussed earlier. China's fundamental concern is stability in Afghanistan. I think there is a near total consensus here in our panel on this issue. Now, how do you achieve this consensus? One way is, of course, to reach out to the Taliban, which the Chinese have done. They keep doing it. And on the other way is you have your iron brother, your all-time strategic ally, who has very deep ties with connections with the Taliban. So you work with them in order to achieve stability. So once you achieve stability, once you get some kind of security guarantees done, you can go to a next level, whatever it is. So that is from the Chinese point of view. From Pakistan's point of view, or even if you look at the whole situation from the Taliban's point of view, the Taliban would get military or strategic support from Pakistan, but it would not get the kind of economic support in the future from Pakistan. So that has to come from China. So the Taliban while at home, the Taliban appear to be stronger this time, but at the same time, internationally speaking, no country has recognized the Taliban. In the 1990s, at least 3 countries had immediately recognized the Taliban. This time, everybody is wary of recognizing the Taliban. So for Pakistan also to retain its influence in Afghanistan, to work with the Taliban, to give some kind of economic might to the Taliban, for investments in Afghanistan, etc., it would need to work with the Chinese as well. So I think this is kind of a triangle. It is a work in progress where each party needs the other in meeting their main goals in the situation.
Ananth, when the US was involved in Afghanistan till last year, we saw they over the years depended a great deal on Pakistan, hoped that they will carry water for them in the country. In your understanding, does Beijing have similar expectations?
I think that Deep, it's interesting that, to my mind, I don't think the Chinese have a very good sense of what is happening domestically in Afghanistan, quite frankly. And I think that it's just they've come to rely quite a lot on Pakistan. And I think the developments since last year have only deepened that. A case could be made that that the Chinese may have found it more comfortable to have had a situation in Afghanistan where maybe it was power sharing, where they aren't totally sort of reliant on one party. And now that they have to deal with the Taliban, I think that one of the biggest consequences of that will be that you're going to see a deepening China-Pakistan relationship. Especially as far as Afghanistan is concerned. And of course, there are other drivers of the China-Pakistan relationship as well. But Stanley mentioned at the start of this discussion that when a lot of attention was focused on the Taliban delegation that went to China, but less so on the visit that took place 3-4 days before that of Qureshi, who met Wang Yi, and they came up with this joint sort of action plan of how they were going to coordinate their Afghan policies. And I think now the Chinese are in a situation where they are very reliant on Pakistan, both in terms of securing their interests, in terms of security, and even at a more basic level, getting a handle of what's going on in Afghanistan. I don't think that they have the kind of resources that America had in terms of its understanding of domestic players and what's happening. So I think that you're definitely going to see, and as far as India is concerned, and I know that there will be people in India watching this, there is a big concern for India when you're seeing a dovetailing of China and Pakistan to such a close degree. That is going to be something that will worry New Delhi.
We're almost out of time, but I'm going to ask one last question to you, Stanley. on India, essentially. I mean, last year we saw Russia being very useful for India in finding room in the entire Afghanistan conversation, helping even India have a conversation with the Taliban. Recent developments, how do they affect India's prospects, more so if Russia and China are moving together in Afghanistan? I think you're on mute.
Sorry. That would pose serious challenges to India, because India has already, I think, to put it bluntly, the return of the Taliban to Kabul is a setback to India. Over the last 20 years, India made heavy investments in Afghanistan, cultivated very strong ties with the Islamic Republic, and then India saw an overnight everything just vanishing with the return of the Taliban. And India was also slow in engaging the Taliban. India has its own reasons. Right now, of course, this is a setback. And if, as we discussed here, and if just let's suppose that the Taliban managed to stabilize its relationship, stabilize Afghanistan, and it works, with the Chinese, the Iranians, and the Russians and other Central Asian republics, and that would, from a strategic point of view, that would pose challenges to India. So India will have to identify its core concerns. Its primary concern is, like any other country, is to make sure that Afghanistan doesn't become a hotbed of terrorism, or the Taliban doesn't host anti-India militant organizations, which it did in the 1990s. So that is the primary concern. So, and then secondly is a general concern is whether the Taliban, under the Taliban rule, if Afghanistan becomes more and more unstable, or the Taliban continue to support other militant organizations, not just anti-India, but Taliban has vital ties with all kind of militant organizations in the region. If the Taliban do that, I think all countries in the region would share the concerns. So that would open up India working with other countries. And on the other side, India has its own specific concerns, as we said, like if the Taliban has already promised Russia and China that they would provide security. But I don't think India has established that kind of engagement with the Taliban. So definitely the primary security concerns are there. So what we write in this book is that we discuss these different scenarios. And all scenarios suggest that to address your concerns, what you have to do is to engage with the Taliban. Then you decide, then you reach a policy. But staying out of the game, staying out of Afghanistan, like you did in the 1990s, is not going to serve your interests.
Absolutely. Stanley, Johny, Ananth Krishnan, Jennifer, Murtazashvili, Aziz Amin, thank you so much for joining us. I'm afraid we've reached absolutely the end of our time. And thank you everyone who've joined us on various social media platforms, on Zoom, on YouTube, on Twitter, and elsewhere. We look forward to joining you soon again in another edition of India and the World. Till then, have a great rest of your day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And congratulations again.
Thank you. Congratulations from my side too.
Thanks, everyone.